From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Eitizaz, and this matters. If you thought only people could be racist but not computers, you might have to think again. A few years ago, Google found itself in the middle of a controversy when its new photo application at the time misidentified Black people as gorillas, forcing the company to issue a strong apology. And a few years before that, Taiwanese-American Joss Wang showed that whenever she tried to take a photo of her Asian family, her Nikon camera would pop up an error message asking if they were blinking. Last week, IBM stopped working on its facial recognition technology, and other big tech giants like Amazon and Microsoft announced a one-year moratorium on selling their systems to police departments. This is 2 years after researchers and human rights advocates called out the gender and racial biases embedded in commercial face recognition systems. These are just a few random examples among many, but they raise an important question. Are these just inevitable glitches that come with tech innovation, or are they symptoms of deep structural racism? So, in today's episode, I talked to Charlton McIlwain about whether technology is out there to liberate and empower us or to control people, and what is the historic legacy behind it. I'm joined now by Professor Charlton McIlwain, who is the Vice Provost at NYU. He also teaches media, culture, and communication there, and he's the author of the book Black Software, The Internet and Racial Justice from the Afronet to Black Lives Matter. Thank you so much, Professor McIlwain, for joining us today.
Thank you. We're very good to be here.
Let's start with the history of the issue of race and technology. What do we know about racial exclusion and discrimination, and how exactly has it evolved to present day online?
Yes, well, the history of race and technology is very long, and one could take the approach of going very early, even before our computational systems, to talk about the ways that various other technologies have been used to exclude, to discriminate against African Americans and other racialized groups as well. Where I tend to start with my history is at the very beginning of the 1960s. And this is the moment where two things are happening. You have the rising zenith of the civil rights movement, and you have the accelerated development of computational technology, of computing, that really starts to be on the rise in development in the early and mid 1960s. And that's where these two things really begin to not only intertwine, but in my view, clash. And they clash in large part because these new computational systems that we were building in the early 1960s did not include, by and large, people who were non-white in their design or their building, or really in thinking about how this new technology would be used. Largely because of that, the technology, computing technology, started very early on becoming used to thwart what folks in power saw as a national threat, a national problem. And that problem was very specifically Black people who were at the time protesting in the streets, protesting in the halls of Congress, trying to fight for their rights. So I point to really in 1965 when President Lyndon Johnson faced what he called the national crime problem, when he identified that problem as largely an urban problem facing or promulgated by Black people and other non-whites that were primarily living in urban areas of the country. And he asked a group of technologists to use the new computing technology to find a solution to this crime problem. And the result of that was new computing technologies that were designed to target and ameliorate the threat that Black people posed to the system, technologies that were used to surveil and to predict and really initiate this thing that we know now and call predictive policing, that had its origins and start there in the mid 1960s.
Right. I actually want to talk a little bit more about that because these are the things that we are talking about right now. But you're saying there's this historical context there going all the way back to the 60s. And you're talking about the links to predictive policing that are there today. Can you talk to me more about a company called Simulmatics Corporations during the 60s, which is written about, and how it was used during elections and during the racial tensions of the 60s, and how this might be seen as a foundation of what we see today in terms of racial profiling, algorithms, and data collection, and basically racially targeted surveillance?
Absolutely. So, it will come as no big surprise today when we look back on a company like Simulmatics, which today is quite normal, and we would just call it behavioral research or behavioral social science. But it had its start in the early 1960s when, with new computing technology, we were able to aggregate data and information and use that data to help predict outcomes, and not only predict outcomes, but to then steer them. And so this was put to a test in 1960 with the presidential election, where Ithiel de Sola-Pool, who was a professor at MIT, political scientist, came up with this method for predicting the outcome of the election, went to the Democratic Party then and said, hey, I've got this new method that I think will help John F. Kennedy's election hopes. And they hired him on, founded this company called Simulmatics. And its work was to aggregate polling data from the previous elections, use that to identify and predict how voters will vote, what issues mattered, and use that to steer the policy message that John F. Kennedy made throughout the country. They were successful in doing that. And then several years later, when we're in the middle of this, what folks call the larger crime problem epidemic, there were riots, protests, various forms of uprisings happening throughout Black communities across the country. And so the government then called on Simulmatics once again to do its work. And that work was really about kind of a surveillance project. They sent folks from Simulmatics into communities where riots had taken place. They interviewed people. They tried to understand who was talking about what to whom, how the riots got started, who spearheaded them. They collected lots of data, not only about what people were doing, but their behaviors, who was buying gas, how many people were coming through toll booths in and out of the city. And they aggregated that data. And what they wanted to do was to then try to, if you will, decapitate the heads, the leaders of these uprisings and make it such that they could not ever happen again. And so that was sort of a format in which this new sort of way of thinking about data was used in the service of surveillance, community surveillance, racial surveillance. And what we've seen from that point in time up to now is simply a perfection of methods, as it were, as our computational systems have advanced and become more sophisticated.
So in a way, this is the baseline for how the relationship between technology and law enforcement in the context of Black people and other racialized communities being targeted over the years. This has been the framework for that.
Yes, absolutely. I always go back to a story a couple of years ago now, where it was reported, I think it was The Intercept had come up with an investigative report that showed that the NYPD had shared its surveillance system, its camera system from across the city with IBM, who was working to develop a facial recognition system that would identify and target criminal suspects based on the color of their skin. And the report, basically hinged on the problem that this entailed, that it was happening. And they also made mention that this was happening undercover for some 5 years at that point. And I remember reading that story and thinking that they completely missed the boat because it wasn't a 5-year story. It was really a 50-year one in terms of the relationship between technologists and between specifically IBM and law enforcement, NYPD being one of them, but between law enforcement across the country and the development and perfection of these computational systems that target Black folks and other communities of color.
Which brings us to one of the biggest debates at the moment. It's interesting that you mentioned IBM and how the story came out a number of years ago. Now, tech giants like Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, and their use of facial recognition technology and providing that to governments and law enforcement is common knowledge. Does facial recognition technology have dangerous implications specifically for Black, Indigenous, and people of color?
Absolutely. I mean, we think of the roots of facial recognition technology that is deeply personal, deeply located in the body. And one could go all the way back to slavery to think about the ways in which controlling, surveilling Black bodies was the foundation for maintaining control and for maintaining white racial power. It was to control, to surveil, to monitor, to track bodies. And so when we look at facial recognition, that is essentially what you have to be able to look at someone's face, their gaze, their physical features that are embodied in this one location, and to use that, turn it into data to then be able to track and surveil. It should be no surprise to anyone the ways in which it gets used, number one, by law enforcement by and large, and that law enforcement uses tend to then overly target and surveil communities of color. And so facial recognition, is problematic in many ways from its very foundation. And it's only by understanding our history, our racial history in this country and really throughout the world, that one can see the direct correlation and likelihood that facial recognition technology would by and large be used for law enforcement purposes.
And there's so much coming out about this now. An MIT study in 2018 first spoke about the gender and racial biases embedded in the system. Just talking about IBM system, for example, they found it was almost 35% worse at classifying for dark-skinned women than light-skinned men.
Yeah, the technology itself has been shown over and over again to be deeply problematic. The way it encodes biases in terms of skin color, skin tone, eye color, hair, and the ways then in which it misrecognizes people of color. And so one can imagine then in a law enforcement context that there is a problematic where folks who may not be the subject or perpetrators of criminal acts get misidentified and therefore pulled into the criminal justice system. But I think it's important to recognize and realize that really, for me, is not the issue. If IBM and Microsoft and others perfected that technology so that there wasn't bias, so there was 100% accuracy, facial recognition would still be deeply problematic because of the premise on which it is built. That is, as I mentioned earlier, to computationally render the body as something trackable, as an object to be seen, to be tracked and utilized by law enforcement and other users. And that's really the problem. It's really that it exists, not so much the problem that it's inaccurate, though that's certainly a problem as well.
So what does it say to you about this moment in history that we're seeing that IBM has stopped working on this technology while Microsoft and Amazon have also imposed a short moratorium on selling this technology to police departments? So is this an admission to what researchers like yourself have been saying all along, that we have a big problem when it comes to this technology?
Yes, and there are many others beyond me and before me who were sounding the warnings that really went unheeded. And developers and so forth at these companies and others developed this technology well knowing how it was being used, well knowing what relationship those companies and these technologies have had historically with law enforcement, people knew that law enforcement at every level, state, local, federal, international, would be one of the primary users of this technology. And so, while I give some credit to these companies for taking a pause, I think it is a pause that is very much guided by the moment, which is the pressure that has been exerted not only by academics, scholars, technologists, but activists and members of overly policed communities who understand and are really making their voice known about the ways in which all policing and all police technologies have criminalized whole communities of people with devastating impacts. And I think we'll really learn the full reach and scope of motivations of these companies to pause these technologies by how far and how long that lasts.
Also, there's other aspects to technology and how it plays out into racialized issues. What role do you think technology has played in what we're seeing happening currently in the wake of George Floyd's death and Black Lives Matter's protests that have reignited?
Yeah, I think you see, a lot going on from all sides and with various sorts of technology that are implicated. On the one hand, you have the resurgence of the very visible Black Lives Matter movement, which, we saw really rise to the fore in 2014, 2015, 2016, and then sort of die down in terms of its public attention or attention, at least in the media landscape. And then its resurgence now in the wake of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, many others who have tragically been killed by police in just these last few weeks and months. And so, on the one hand, you have a display yet again of how social media platforms, other forms of technology built in our smartphones and other digitally connected devices, the ways in which those can be used to voice and to amplify voices to counter the systemic and structural racism that is going on today. And I think that we're seeing some of the fruits of that in these recognitions by the technology companies to ban or pause facial recognition, seeing it in the powerful movement for law enforcement to change policies, to curtail, to really rethink what it means to be police and what policing means and what law enforcement means. All of that, I think, are directly tied to the ways in which Black folks and other communities of color have marshaled digital tools to amplify their voices. On the other hand, we know very well that those same tools are in the hands of others. Communities of color, individuals of color, by and large, do not own these technologies, don't own these platforms. And so we are at the whim of their dictates. So the same tools that activists use to amplify their message are the same tools and platforms that law enforcement use to surveil and track suspects, to find people who are protesting, days later, to be able to go back to social media posts and identify suspects of potential violence or alleged violence during some of these protest moments. So it's a back and forth, a give and take, in which it's really a matter of technological power, of racial power. And so our technology is really following the pathway of our politics, our racial politics, and so forth. And I think that puts it on very shaky ground, meaning we know who always wins that game. Power always finds a way to sustain itself. And I think in many ways, that's what we're seeing unfold.
And that's a large part of your book, Black Software, as well. It speaks about technology being used to surveil and marginalize Black communities. But as you've explained, it also has been leveraged for activism. So on the one hand, it's linked to control and exclusion, but it's also a way for Black Americans and other marginalized communities to get around gatekeepers, like mainstream media, for example, by creating digital activism, such as in the Black Lives Movement that we're talking about. So can you speak more to those two sides of the relationship? You're talking about the power balance here. How can we harness this power, this technology, to actually leverage it better for racial equality and social justice?
Yeah, that's a big question that I don't know that I have the answer to. What I can speak to is that when we see both sides of the same coin through a historical lens, what we see is a constant back and forth where technologists who are owning, designing, controlling the uses of these technologies are doing so sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly and inadvertently in ways that negatively impact communities of color. At the same time, then communities of color who innovate, who build on existing technology for their own purposes, from simply the mundane ability to enjoy everyday life to using it as tools for explicit political action and racial justice activism. And there always seems to be this sort of game that plays out, if you will, this pattern that plays out where that technology exists, gets built, gets used, communities of color that innovate, and then folks who control and are in power of those technologies in large part sort of catch up and course correct such that that technology then continues to be used to maintain social, economic, political power. And we go back and forth in this battle, this tug of war. And so in some ways, I think the answer lies in the continued struggle in that way, that communities of color continue to master technological tools, whether they developed, invented, or distributed them or not, to master them so that they can control how they will be used by and for their own interests. But I think at a certain point, we have to question how far we can go using technologies that are not explicitly owned by communities of color, that are not designed with the input of communities of color, that are not designed with the explicit interests of communities of color in mind. And so I think that's in large part what has to change if we are to see some revolutionary changes in the way that our technology works to either push or push back on our interests in some way. And so that ownership piece, I think, is important. I think it's what is persistently lacking when we go from the 60s to the 70s, 80s, 90s on up to the present, that there are moments and there are bursts where there are Black folks and other people of color who are owning, building, designing these technologies that have broad impact, but then they tend to quickly go away. And that's part of the story of Black software, about that moment in the 1990s when there was a kind of a moment where you saw African Americans, as I focus on, who were technologists, who were venture capitalists, who were community activists, who used and owned technologies and platforms that they could put to good use. But that lasted for only a moment. And when we look out on the horizon today, we see very few owners with highly capitalized ventures that are owned by folks who are not white.
Why is that? Because you're talking about this moment in history when this happened. So how did they get pushed out of those spaces to become what is now an issue of accessibility and inclusivity of Black and POC into the tech space?
I think a lot of it is very deliberate exclusion. Even when we look beyond technology and simply into the economic realm, power begets power, and power wants to preserve itself. And so when we look at those who have the kind of money it takes to fund long-term, very successful ventures, you certainly don't have a groundswell of Black and brown folks who have access to that on their own. And then when you're looking for folks who are trying to seek funding, it's a small club. And I remember, as I was writing Black software and talking to very successful technology platform owners, Black owners in that day, and asking them what's the difference between the 90s and the early 2000s and now. And they talk about simply the lack of access to capital, and really the lack of access to the networks where that capital and wealth resides. And so you have perfectly great technologists, people who are Harvard educated at very elite schools, at the top of their game, at the top of their craft in terms of being scientists, engineers, and so forth. But they could not break into those circles of people who said, here are millions or several of millions or even more dollars to back your new venture. And so it's that lack of the ability to break into those networks, which have traditionally been very small, very insular, and very white. And that remains to be the reason why you see relatively few technology companies that are commercially successful.
Thank you so much, Professor Charlton McIlwain, for talking to us. You've been extremely insightful.
Absolutely. Great to be with you. Thank you.
That was Charlton McIlwain, professor and vice provost at New York University, and also the author of the book Black Software. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Saba Eitizaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mudhir. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.